I don't care what color he is, I will not sit next to him for 4 hours. The words would echo through social media within hours, but right now they were just forming in Victoria Pemberton's mind as she applied her morning skincare routine in her Denver penthouse, completely unaware that in Baltimore the man she would try to destroy was already awake, preparing for what would become the most important flight of both their lives. Dr. Jonathan Hayes stood in his study at 4:30 in the morning, the same ritual he'd followed for 20 years since completing his residency at Johns Hopkins. The leather medical bag his mother Rosa had saved 3 months to buy him sat open on his mahogany desk, its contents methodically arranged like surgical instruments before an operation. Patient files, conference notes, and his mother's faded photograph watched over his preparations for the Neurosurgical Symposium in Chicago that would showcase his groundbreaking work on pediatric brain tumor removal. The house around him breathed with the quiet satisfaction of a life built through decades of discipline and sacrifice, every piece of furniture chosen not for its price tag but for its durability. Every book on his shelves earned through countless nights when sleep seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. His fingers traced the silver frame holding Rosa's image taken just months before the lung disease claimed her at 52. Her smile still radiant, despite the exhaustion that came from cleaning office buildings 12 hours a day to pay for his medical school textbooks. Every patient you save carries forward the love I couldn't give to the families. I never had time to help, she had whispered during their last conversation in the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams. Those words had shaped every surgery he'd performed, every late night he'd spent developing techniques that would give other mothers more time with their children, other sons and daughters, the chance to say goodbye properly. The wall behind his desk displayed not the typical ego monuments of successful physicians, but photographs of patients who had survived because of innovations he'd pioneered. Children who had returned to playgrounds and classrooms because he'd found ways to reach tumors that other surgeons declared inoperable. Each frame represented hundreds of hours spent in operating rooms where millimeters meant the difference between a child's first steps and a funeral where his steady hands carried the weight of parents' prayers and his own mother's memory. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patricia Chen, the conference organizer at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, confirming his keynote presentation scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon. The revolutionary surgical protocol he'd developed for treating aggressive pediatric brain cancers had already been adopted by medical centers across Europe, and today's presentation would introduce it to the largest gathering of neurosurgeons in North America. The technique, which he'd named the Rosa method in honor of his mother's persistent optimism, had improved survival rates by 37% in preliminary trials. Jonathan closed the medical bag with the same careful precision he brought to closing surgical incisions, checking twice that his presentation materials were secure in the padded compartment his mother had specially requested when she'd ordered the bag from a catalog she'd found at the library. He could still see her sitting at their kitchen table, circling the most expensive option, and declaring that her son deserved the best tools for saving lives, even if it meant she'd eat peanut butter sandwiches for lunch instead of the cafeteria meals at the office building where she worked. The early morning flight from Baltimore to Chicago would give him time to review his notes one final time before facing an audience that included some of the most accomplished medical minds in the world, colleagues who had initially dismissed his theories as too ambitious, too risky, too dependent on hoping that precision could overcome the seemingly impossible. Now they were requesting copies of his research protocols and inviting him to consult on cases that had stumped entire medical teams' recognition that felt simultaneously like vindication and responsibility. As he loaded his luggage into the car service that would take him to Baltimore-Washington International Airport, Jonathan Hayes had no way of knowing that in a Denver penthouse overlooking the Rocky Mountains, Victoria Pemberton was selecting the designer outfit she would wear to destroy him, or that their collision would create ripples extending far beyond the confines of a first-class airplane cabin. The morning air carried the promise of change, though neither of them could have imagined how completely their worlds were about to shift. Victoria Pemberton's reflection gazed back at her from the bathroom mirror of her Denver penthouse, with the cold satisfaction of a woman who had spent 68 years perfecting the art of getting exactly what she wanted when she wanted it, regardless of who stood in her way. The morning skincare routine that had preserved her surgically enhanced features involved 17 different products, each more expensive than most people's monthly grocery budget, applied with the methodical precision of someone who understood that maintaining power required constant vigilance against any sign of weakness or vulnerability. Her walk-in closet contained more clothing than most department stores organized by season occasion and the specific impression she intended to create, because Victoria had learned decades ago that appearance was the first weapon in any battle for dominance. Today's selection required careful consideration, since she would be attending the Pemberton Foundation's annual charity gala in Chicago, an event where she would announce the establishment of a new scholarship fund that would cement her social legacy while providing tax advantages that her accountants had spent months calculating. The foundation had been her late husband's idea, conceived during the final months of his battle with pancreatic cancer, as a way to rehabilitate the family name after decades of whispered accusations about the pharmaceutical company's labor practices and environmental violations. Victoria had embraced the charity work not from any genuine desire to help others, but because it provided the perfect platform for maintaining her position at the apex of Denver's social hierarchy, surrounded by politicians, business leaders, and other wealthy widows who competed for influence through carefully orchestrated displays of public generosity. Her penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of Denver's most exclusive residential tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains that served as a daily reminder of her elevated status above the ordinary people who struggled through their unremarkable lives in the city below. Every piece of furniture had been selected by designers whose names appeared in architectural magazines, every artwork chosen not for personal enjoyment, but for the conversations it would generate at dinner parties where social connections translated directly into financial opportunities. The pharmaceutical empire that had funded her lifestyle had been built on her husband's willingness to cut corners wherever possible, from the factory workers who were exposed to dangerous chemicals without proper protection to the clinical trial participants who weren't fully informed about potential side effects of experimental medications. Victoria had attended board meetings where executives discussed these issues in the abstract language of acceptable risk and cost-benefit analysis, never acknowledging that their decisions affected real families whose suffering became footnotes in quarterly earnings reports. She had perfected the art of charitable giving that generated maximum publicity while requiring minimum personal sacrifice, hosting galas, where ticket prices ensured that only people of appropriate social standing could attend, supporting causes that enhanced her reputation without challenging the underlying systems that had created the problems she claimed to address. The scholarship fund she would announce today had been structured to benefit students from families wealthy enough to navigate the complex application process, ensuring that her generosity would flow toward people who reminded her of herself rather than those who actually needed help. Her jewelry collection included pieces that had belonged to European royalty, purchased at auction houses where she competed with museums and other collectors who understood that owning beautiful objects created an aura of sophistication that money alone couldn't buy. Each necklace, bracelet, and ring had been selected not just for its monetary value, but for its ability to communicate her status to anyone who understood the language of luxury, a vocabulary she had mastered through decades of study and practice. The car service that transported her to Denver International Airport included a driver who had been trained never to speak unless directly addressed, understanding that Victoria's time was too valuable to waste on casual conversation with someone she considered part of the scenery rather than a human being deserving of basic courtesy. Her first-class ticket to Chicago had been upgraded to the most expensive seat on the plane. Through a combination of frequent flyer status and strategic donations to the airline's corporate foundation, ensuring that she would be surrounded by people who shared her expectations about service and deference. As the limousine glided through Denver's morning traffic toward the airport, Victoria reviewed her mental checklist of the social connections she planned to cultivate at the evening's gala. Politicians, whose votes could be influenced through campaign contributions, business leaders whose companies could benefit from pharmaceutical partnerships, and fellow philanthropists whose endorsements could elevate her standing in the complex hierarchy of charitable giving that determined social rank among America's wealthiest families. She had no way of knowing that the carefully constructed world she had spent decades building was about to collide with a neurosurgeon whose mother had died from lung disease caused by chemicals produced in her husband's factories, or that her reflexive racism would trigger a chain reaction that would strip away every layer of protection her money and connections had provided. The morning sun reflected off the limousine's tinted windows as Victoria Pemberton traveled toward her appointment with consequences that had been building for decades, carried forward by the accumulated weight of every life her family's business practices had damaged or destroyed. Captain Rebecca Torres completed her pre-flight inspection of the Boeing 777 with the same meticulous attention to detail that had earned her recognition as one of the most skilled pilots in commercial aviation. Her trained eyes scanning every surface gauge and indicator for any sign of potential trouble that could compromise the safety of the 247 passengers who would entrust their lives to her judgment and expertise during the 4-hour flight from Denver to Chicago. The aircraft itself represented millions of dollars in engineering precision, its twin engines capable of generating enough thrust to lift nearly 500,000 pounds into the thin air above 30,000 feet, where the margin for error disappeared entirely, and every decision carried the weight of absolute responsibility. Her career had begun in the Air Force, where she had learned to land fighter jets on aircraft carriers in storms that would ground civilian flights, where she had developed the unshakable confidence that came from knowing she could handle any emergency that physics and human fallibility might create. The transition to commercial aviation had required adjustments to her leadership style, learning to project calm authority over passengers who had never faced life-or-death situations, rather than combat pilots who understood that survival depended on instant obedience to command decisions. But the fundamental principles remained unchanged. The crew briefing that morning had covered weather conditions, alternate airports, passenger manifest anomalies, and the dozens of other variables that could affect flight safety. But nothing in her training had prepared her for the type of turbulence that would develop in the first-class cabin once passengers began boarding. Lead flight attendant Maria Santos had worked with Rebecca for 3 years, long enough to recognize the subtle signs of tension in her captain's voice when discussing difficult passengers. Though neither woman could have anticipated the storm that was gathering as baggage handlers loaded the final pieces of luggage into the cargo hold below. Maria's experience with challenging passengers had taught her to identify potential problems during the boarding process, reading body language and listening for tone-of-voice indicators that might predict conflict before it erupted into situations requiring crew intervention. The manifest showed a full, first-class cabin, always a recipe for potential friction between passengers accustomed to having their preferences accommodated without question. But today's flight included names that made the ground crew nervous based on previous encounters with entitled behavior and unreasonable demands. Dr. Jonathan Hayes had been among the first passengers to board, settling into seat 2B with the quiet efficiency of someone who traveled frequently on medical business. His leather briefcase stowed carefully in the overhead compartment, and his attention immediately focused on the research documents that would form the foundation of his afternoon presentation in Chicago. Other passengers had noticed his professional demeanor and expensive suit, making assumptions about his background and status that would prove both accurate and irrelevant to the confrontation that was building as the boarding process continued. Victoria Pemberton's arrival in the first-class cabin had created the subtle shift in atmosphere that always accompanied the presence of someone who expected immediate deference from everyone around them. her designer luggage handled with extra care by flight attendants who recognized the signs of a passenger capable of generating complaints that could affect their employment evaluations. Her seat assignment in 2A placed her directly adjacent to Dr. Hayes, a proximity that would have been unremarkable under normal circumstances, but became the focal point of racial hatred that had been simmering beneath her carefully maintained social facade for decades. The other first-class passengers included business executives returning from Denver meetings, families traveling to Chicago for weddings or reunions, and tourists whose vacation schedules had been disrupted by earlier flight cancellations, creating a diverse group of people whose only common characteristic was their ability to afford premium seats that cost more than many families spent on monthly housing payments. Among them was Professor Eleanor Chen, an Asian American academic whose experience with discrimination had taught her to recognize the warning signs of racial conflict before it escalated into open confrontation. The cabin itself had been designed to project luxury and exclusivity, with leather seats that converted into fully flat beds, personal entertainment systems, and service standards that promised to make passengers forget they were traveling in a metal tube 7 miles above the Earth's surface at speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. The soft lighting and carefully controlled temperature created an environment intended to promote relaxation and comfort, though the atmosphere began to change as Victoria's agitation became visible to anyone paying attention to her increasingly frequent glances toward her seat neighbor. Rebecca Torres remained focused on the technical aspects of preparing for departure, coordinating with air traffic control for takeoff clearance, reviewing weather updates for the flight path to Chicago, and confirming that all passengers and crew members were properly secured for the journey ahead. Her experience had taught her that the vast majority of flights proceeded without incident, that the sophisticated systems and protocols governing commercial aviation had been refined through decades of continuous improvement designed to eliminate risk and ensure passenger safety under virtually any circumstances that might arise during normal operations. The tension building in the first-class cabin remained invisible from the cockpit, where Captain Torres and her co-pilot were completing the final items on their pre-flight checklist, trusting that the experienced cabin crew would handle any passenger-related issues that might develop during the boarding process or the early phases of flight. Neither the captain nor her fellow crew members could have imagined that they were about to face a situation that would test not just their professional training, but their fundamental beliefs about human dignity, justice, and the moral responsibilities that extended far beyond the technical requirements of safely operating a commercial aircraft. As the boarding process neared completion and the ground crew prepared to close the cabin doors, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone aboard Flight 847 to choose between the comfortable silence of looking the other way and the uncomfortable courage required to stand up for what was right, even when doing so would come at significant personal and professional cost. Victoria Pemberton's first indication that her carefully orchestrated day was about to be ruined came when she noticed the man seated in 2B, his dark skin and professional attire creating an immediate cognitive dissonance with her assumptions about who belonged in first-class accommodations. Her initial reaction was a sharp intake of breath that she quickly disguised as dissatisfaction with the cabin temperature, though the real source of her discomfort had nothing to do with the aircraft's climate control system and everything to do with decades of unexamined prejudice that had shaped her worldview since childhood, in an exclusively white social circle that treated diversity as a theoretical concept rather than lived reality. Dr. Jonathan Hayes remained absorbed in his medical journals, completely unaware that his mere presence was generating waves of hostile energy from the woman beside him. His concentration focused on reviewing the surgical protocols he would present to his colleagues in Chicago, rather than monitoring the increasingly agitated behavior of a passenger whose racial antipathy was building toward an explosive confrontation. His professional demeanor and expensive suit should have signaled his status as a fellow member of the educated elite, but Victoria's vision was clouded by assumptions that automatically classified him as an intruder who had somehow gained unauthorized access to spaces reserved for people like herself. The passive-aggressive phase of Victoria's campaign began with theatrical sighing. Conspicuous bag rearrangement and exaggerated seat adjustments designed to communicate her displeasure without directly confronting the source of her discomfort. She opened and closed her Hermes purse, repeatedly checking and rechecking items that didn't need attention, hoping that her obvious agitation would prompt airline staff to recognize her distress and offer solutions that would restore her comfort without requiring her to explicitly voice the racist motivations behind her behavior. Maria Santos had been observing the developing situation from her position near the galley, her experienced eye recognizing the warning signs of passenger conflict that could escalate into situations requiring crew intervention if not addressed through diplomatic engagement and professional de-escalation techniques. Her approach to Victoria combined genuine concern for passenger comfort with the firm boundaries necessary to maintain order in a confined space where individual preferences had to be balanced against collective needs and airline policies that applied equally to all travelers, regardless of their perceived social status. "Is there anything I can help you with?" "Mrs. Pemberton." Maria's voice carried the trained warmth of a professional who had learned to project calm authority, even when dealing with situations that challenged her personal patience and diplomatic skills. Victoria's response revealed the entitled mindset that had governed her interactions with service workers throughout her privileged life, an assumption that her comfort took precedence over policy fairness and the basic human dignity of fellow passengers who had equal rights to the seats they had purchased. "I'm feeling quite uncomfortable with this seating arrangement." Victoria's voice carried the imperious tone she had perfected through decades of getting her way through a combination of social pressure and financial influence, her words carefully chosen to imply that her discomfort resulted from factors beyond her control, rather than her own prejudicial attitudes toward sharing space with someone whose racial identity challenged her assumptions about social hierarchy and appropriate boundaries. The coded language of Victoria's complaint was immediately recognizable to Maria, who had encountered similar situations throughout her career in customer service, where customers often used euphemisms like unsafe, uncomfortable, or inappropriate to mask racist motivations that they understood would be unacceptable if stated directly. Her professional training emphasized the importance of addressing passenger concerns while maintaining equal treatment for all travelers, a balance that required careful navigation when dealing with complaints rooted in prejudice rather than legitimate service issues. "Doctor." Hayes glanced up from his medical journals as Victoria's voice grew louder, his expression showing mild concern for what appeared to be a passenger experiencing some form of travel-related anxiety, though he had no way of knowing that he was the source of her agitation, rather than a potential helper who might offer assistance if she was dealing with claustrophobia or other common flight-related stresses. His offer to help, made with the genuine kindness that characterized his interactions with patients and colleagues, only intensified Victoria's rage by challenging her assumption that he would remain silent and invisible throughout the journey. "I don't need assistance from passengers." Victoria's response carried a sharp edge that transformed the previously civilized cabin atmosphere into something tense and uncomfortable. Her rejection of Jonathan's offered help revealing the depth of her racial animosity to everyone within hearing distance. The other first-class passengers began to recognize that they were witnessing something more significant than ordinary travel stress, their conversations quieting as they focused attention on a confrontation that was clearly building toward a more serious conflict. Professor Eleanor Chen discreetly activated her phone's recording function, her academic background in social justice having taught her to document instances of discrimination that might otherwise disappear into individual memory, without creating the accountability that came from preserved evidence. Her experience with racial bias in academic settings had shown her the importance of creating records that could support victims of discrimination when they faced institutions that preferred to minimize or dismiss complaints rather than acknowledge wrongdoing. The transformation of Victoria's demeanor from passive aggressiveness to open hostility marked the point where the situation moved beyond normal passenger services into territory that would require intervention by flight crew members, with authority to enforce policies and maintain order. Maria's recognition that diplomatic solutions were no longer sufficient prompted her to signal for backup from other crew members, while simultaneously trying to de-escalate through professional engagement that acknowledged Victoria's concerns without validating the racist assumptions underlying her complaints. Mrs. Pemberton, I understand you have concerns about your seating assignment, but I need to explain our policies regarding passenger accommodations and the options available within the constraints of a fully booked flight. Maria's response combined empathy with firm boundaries, making it clear that while the airline valued customer satisfaction solutions would have to be found within the framework of equal treatment for all passengers, rather than special accommodations that would discriminate against travelers based on their racial identity. Victoria's reaction to this measured response revealed the extent to which her sense of entitlement had been challenged by encountering a service provider who refused to automatically prioritize her preferences over fundamental principles of fairness and dignity. Her anger intensifying as she realized that her usual combination of social pressure and implied financial threats might not be sufficient to achieve the outcome she demanded. The escalation from passive aggression to open confrontation began when Victoria Pemberton realized that subtle hints and coded language had failed to achieve her desired outcome, forcing her to abandon the veneer of respectability that had always protected her from accountability for her racist attitudes. Her voice rose above the conversational murmur of other first-class passengers as she abandoned euphemisms in favor of language that left no doubt about the racial motivations behind her demands for a seating change that would restore her comfort by removing the black passenger whose presence had violated her assumptions about appropriate social boundaries. I paid premium prices for premium accommodations, and that includes not having to sit next to people who clearly don't belong, in first-class Victoria's words, carried across the cabin with the sharp clarity of broken glass, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn as fellow passengers processed the shocking directness of her racist declaration. The careful politeness that had previously governed interactions between strangers in the confined space of an airplane cabin dissolved as everyone present was forced to choose between the comfortable silence of looking away and the moral courage required to acknowledge what they were witnessing. Dr. Jonathan Hayes felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied encounters with racism, a physical response that had developed through decades of facing prejudice in medical school residency training and professional conferences, where his competence was questioned by people who couldn't imagine that excellence might exist, regardless of racial identity. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that dignity came from within and couldn't be taken away by people whose hatred revealed their own moral poverty rather than any deficiency in their targets. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Jonathan's response demonstrated the grace under pressure that had served him well in operating rooms where life and death decisions required absolute calm. Despite external chaos, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected by colleagues who valued competence over prejudice. His attempt to de-escalate through reason and courtesy would have worked in most professional settings, but Victoria's rage had moved beyond rational discourse into territory where facts and logic held no power against decades of accumulated racial resentment. Professor Eleanor Chen's fingers moved quickly across her phone's screen as she documented the unfolding confrontation, her academic training having taught her that instances of discrimination often disappeared into competing narratives unless preserved through objective evidence that could support subsequent accountability efforts. Her own experiences with anti-Asian prejudice had shown her the importance of allies who were willing to step forward as witnesses rather than passive observers, understanding that silence in the face of injustice amounted to complicity with the systems that allowed discrimination to flourish. Other passengers began to demonstrate the complex psychology of bystander behavior, with some individuals looking away in obvious discomfort, while others leaned forward to better hear and observe a confrontation that challenged their assumptions about progress in racial relations and the persistence of overt prejudice in supposedly enlightened social circles. The cabin's atmosphere grew heavy with tension as people processed their own moral obligations in a situation where neutrality was no longer possible, and every choice carried implications for their personal integrity and social responsibility. Maria Santos felt the weight of professional responsibility as she recognized that standard customer service protocols were inadequate for addressing a situation that had moved beyond ordinary passenger complaints into territory that required moral leadership and institutional accountability. Her training had prepared her for medical emergencies, security threats, and technical malfunctions. But nothing in her professional education had provided specific guidance for moments when passengers used racial hatred as a weapon against fellow travelers who had equal rights to dignity and respect. Mrs. Pemberton, I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat while we work on finding a solution that addresses your concerns within our policy framework. Maria's attempt to maintain professional composure while establishing clear boundaries reflected her understanding that crew authority depended on projecting calm competence even when facing situations that challenged both personal and institutional values. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid either endorsing or explicitly condemning Victoria's racist language while buying time to consult with supervisors who had ultimate responsibility for policy decisions. Victoria's response revealed the depth of her entitlement and her assumption that financial influence could override moral principles. Her threats about knowing airline executives and board members representing the standard playbook of privileged individuals accustomed to using connections and implied economic leverage to achieve outcomes that fairness and policy would normally prohibit. Her escalating demands for immediate action to remove Dr. Hayes from first class demonstrated her inability to conceive that her preferences might not automatically take precedence over his equal right to the seat he had purchased and occupied legally. The moment when other passengers began to voice objections to Victoria's behavior marked a crucial transition in the cabin's social dynamics, transforming what had begun as a confrontation between two individuals into a broader conflict about community values and collective responsibility for maintaining dignity and respect in shared spaces. Their willingness to risk personal comfort by challenging her racist language demonstrated the power of moral courage to shift social dynamics and create accountability for behavior that depended on silence and complicity for its effectiveness. "That's completely unacceptable," declared Robert Martinez, a business executive whose own experience with workplace discrimination had taught him the importance of speaking up when witnessing injustice rather than allowing hatred to flourish through passive acceptance. His intervention encouraged other passengers to find their voices, creating a chorus of disapproval that began to isolate Victoria from the social support she had expected to receive from fellow first-class travelers who shared her economic status, if not her racial prejudices. The cabin's transformation from a space governed by polite anonymity to an arena where fundamental values were being contested in real time created an atmosphere of electric tension that seemed to charge the recycled air with moral significance. Every passenger present understood that they were participating in something larger than a simple seating dispute, that their individual responses would reflect their deepest beliefs about human dignity, social justice, and personal responsibility for creating the kind of world they wanted to inhabit. Dr. Hayes maintained his composure despite the emotional toll of being subjected to public humiliation, his professional training in crisis management helping him project calm strength while internally processing the familiar pain of encountering hatred that reduced his decades of achievement and service to nothing more than racial stereotypes that existed only in the distorted perception of people whose worldview had been shaped by prejudice rather than experience with actual human diversity and complexity. Captain Rebecca Torres received Maria Santos's urgent communication through the cabin interphone system while completing the final pre-flight checks that would normally have led to pushback from the gate and the beginning of a routine journey to Chicago. But the tension in her senior flight attendant's voice immediately signaled that routine had been shattered by circumstances that would require command decisions extending far beyond technical aviation protocols. Her military training had prepared her for situations where leadership meant choosing between competing priorities under pressure, where the comfortable path of minimal resistance might conflict with deeper principles that defined both personal integrity and institutional responsibility. The cockpit's atmosphere of technical precision and methodical preparation provided a sharp contrast to the emotional chaos building in the passenger cabin, where decades of social progress were being tested by one woman's determination to enforce racial boundaries that belonged to an earlier, uglier era of American history. Captain Torres understood that her response to the developing crisis would extend far beyond the immediate welfare of the passengers and crew under her command, potentially influencing broader conversations about institutional accountability and moral leadership in situations where doing the right thing carried significant professional and financial risks. Her decision to leave the cockpit and personally assess the situation represented a departure from standard protocols that typically delegated passenger relations to trained flight attendants while keeping flight crews focused on technical operations. But the severity of Maria's report and the potential for escalation into violence or federal civil rights violations demanded direct involvement from the person with ultimate authority over aircraft operations and crew actions. The walk from the flight deck to the first-class cabin felt longer than usual, weighted with awareness that her next few minutes would define not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but potentially her entire career trajectory. The scene that greeted Captain Torres in the first-class cabin was immediately recognizable from her military experience with personnel conflicts that revealed character under pressure, where individuals' deepest beliefs about hierarchy, respect, and human dignity became visible through their responses to unexpected challenges to their assumptions and comfort zones. Victoria Pemberton's body language radiated the entitled rage of someone unaccustomed to having her demands questioned or delayed, while Dr. Hayes projected the controlled dignity of a professional who had learned to maintain composure, despite facing prejudice that questioned his right to occupy spaces that his achievements had clearly earned. "I'm Captain Torres, and I understand there's been a disagreement about seating arrangements." Her opening statement was deliberately neutral in tone while establishing clear command authority that would frame whatever solutions emerged from the subsequent discussion. Her military bearing and confident demeanor immediately commanding attention from passengers who had been witnessing a conflict that seemed to be spiraling beyond normal resolution mechanisms. Her presence in the cabin signaled that the situation had escalated beyond routine customer service issues into territory that required institutional response and potential policy enforcement. Victoria's assumption that the captain's arrival represented validation of her complaints and imminent resolution in her favor reflected the lifelong pattern of receiving preferential treatment from authority figures who shared her social background and economic status. Her expectation of automatic deference blinding her to the possibility that professional airline personnel might prioritize policy compliance and equal treatment over customer appeasement when fundamental principles were at stake. Her confident smile and straightened posture demonstrated her certainty that rank would align with race and class to restore the social order she believed had been disrupted by Dr. Hayes's presence in first-class accommodations. "Captain, finally someone with authority to address this situation properly." Victoria's voice carried the tone of someone addressing a subordinate expected to execute her preferences without question. Her assumption that shared professional status would automatically generate sympathy for her position, revealing the depth of her disconnect from contemporary values about diversity, inclusion, and equal treatment under institutional policies designed to protect all passengers from discrimination based on personal characteristics beyond their control. Captain Torres's military background had provided extensive experience with personnel from diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds, creating a worldview based on merit, performance, and character rather than superficial characteristics that had no bearing on professional competence or personal worth. Her response to Victoria's expectation of preferential treatment was shaped by years of command responsibility that had taught her to evaluate situations based on facts, fairness, and institutional values, rather than the personal preferences of individuals who might outrank others in social hierarchy, but remained subject to the same rules and policies that governed everyone under her authority. Mrs. Pemberton, I need to understand exactly what your concerns are and what specific outcome you're requesting. Captain Torres's investigative approach was designed to create a clear record of the situation while giving Victoria an opportunity to articulate her demands in language that would reveal whether they were based on legitimate service issues or discriminatory attitudes that would be unacceptable under federal civil rights law and airline policy. Her question also served notice to everyone present that resolution would be based on facts and policy, rather than assumptions about passenger hierarchy or social influence. The captain's direct engagement with Dr. Hayes demonstrated her commitment to hearing all perspectives before making decisions that would affect multiple passengers and crew members. Her respectful tone and attentive posture communicating recognition of his equal status as a passenger, deserving dignity and fair treatment, regardless of Victoria's objections to his presence in first class. Her questions about his experience with the situation created space for his voice to be heard, and his perspective to be considered in whatever resolution emerged from the confrontation. Dr. Hayes's calm recitation of events corroborated by multiple passenger witnesses who had observed Victoria's escalating racist language and demanding behavior provided Captain Torres with clear evidence that the conflict stemmed from discriminatory attitudes rather than legitimate service failures or policy violations that might justify passenger accommodation requests. His professional demeanor and obvious qualifications as a medical specialist traveling on business further undermined any suggestion that his presence in first class resulted from error or inappropriate upgrade decisions. The moment when Captain Torres fully grasped the scope of Victoria's racist demands marked the point where her military training, personal values, and professional responsibilities aligned to create absolute clarity about the appropriate response to a situation that tested institutional commitment to equal treatment and human dignity. Her recognition that appeasing Victoria's preferences would require discriminatory action against Dr. Hayes created an ethical framework that made compromise impossible and demanded decisive leadership that would prioritize justice over customer satisfaction. I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. Mrs. Pemberton, Captain Torres's voice carried the controlled intensity that preceded command decisions with far-reaching consequences, her words designed to create an unambiguous record of Victoria's discriminatory demands, while giving her one final opportunity to reconsider a course of action that was about to have devastating personal and legal consequences. The cabin fell completely silent as passengers and crew members recognized that they were witnessing a pivotal moment that would define the moral character of everyone involved in the unfolding confrontation. Captain Rebecca Torres's hand moved to the aircraft's public address microphone with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that her next words would be recorded, analyzed, and potentially replayed millions of times across social media platforms, where individual moments of moral courage could inspire broader conversations about institutional responsibility and social justice. The weight of command authority had never felt heavier as she prepared to make a decision that would affect not just the immediate passengers and crew under her responsibility, but potentially influence industry standards and public expectations about how discrimination should be confronted when it emerged in spaces where silence had historically enabled hatred to flourish unchallenged. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Her voice carried through the cabin's speaker system with the calm authority that passengers associated with routine operational announcements, though the tension in the first-class section made it clear that nothing about this situation fell within normal parameters of commercial aviation. The contrast between her professional tone and the emotional chaos that had been building throughout the boarding process created an atmosphere of suspended anticipation, as if the entire aircraft was holding its breath while waiting to learn how institutional power would respond to individual prejudice. We have encountered a passenger situation that requires immediate resolution before this aircraft can safely proceed to Chicago. Captain Torres continued her careful word choice designed to communicate the seriousness of the circumstances while maintaining the professional dignity that had defined her career in both military and civilian aviation. Her decision to address all passengers rather than limiting her response to the individuals directly involved in the confrontation reflected her understanding that discrimination affected entire communities, not just its immediate targets, and that collective accountability was necessary to create meaningful change. Victoria Pemberton's expression shifted from confident expectation to confused concern as she began to recognize that the captain's announcement might not be leading toward the outcome. She had anticipated her assumption that authority would automatically align with her racial and class prejudices, giving way to dawning awareness that contemporary institutional values might prioritize equal treatment over customer appeasement. The social dynamics she had relied on throughout her privileged life were beginning to crumble as she encountered a professional who had been trained to evaluate situations based on merit and policy, rather than personal preference or social influence. Due to discriminatory behavior by a passenger in first class and in accordance with federal civil rights law and airline policy, I am making the decision to return this aircraft to the gate and deplane all passengers. Captain Torres's words fell across the cabin like thunderclaps, each syllable carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate inconvenience of delayed travel plans. Her public identification of discrimination as the cause of flight cancellation created an unambiguous record that would make subsequent legal proceedings inevitable, while demonstrating institutional commitment to principles that transcended customer service concerns. The collective gasp from passengers throughout the aircraft reflected their recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their travel experience, a moment when institutional authority chose moral leadership over operational efficiency and customer satisfaction. The financial implications of canceling a fully booked flight between major cities would be enormous, involving not just direct operational costs, but also passenger compensation rebooking expenses and potential legal liability making. Captain Torres's decision, a powerful statement about values that extended beyond simple economic calculation. Dr. Jonathan Hayes felt a complex mixture of gratitude and sadness as he processed the captain's announcement, appreciating her willingness to take decisive action against discrimination, while recognizing that her moral courage would come at significant personal and professional cost. His experience with institutional responses to racism had taught him to expect compromise solutions that minimized disruption, while avoiding clear stands on principle, making Captain Torres's unambiguous rejection of discriminatory behavior both surprising and profoundly moving. Victoria's transformation from entitled confidence to shocked disbelief was visible to everyone in the first-class cabin, as she realized that her social influence and economic leverage had not only failed to achieve her desired outcome, but had actually triggered consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate inconvenience of missing her Chicago gala. Her threats about knowing airline executives and board members suddenly seemed hollow and ineffective when confronted with a captain who was willing to risk her career rather than accommodate discriminatory demands. This decision is final and non-negotiable. Captain Torres continued, her voice growing stronger as she articulated principles that had guided her military service and civilian career. Our airline will not tolerate discrimination against passengers based on race, religion, gender, or any other personal characteristic. Every passenger who purchases a ticket has the right to travel with dignity and respect, and we will not compromise that principle for any reason or any individual. The sound of passengers throughout the cabin beginning to talk, some expressing frustration about missed connections and delayed plans, while others voiced support for the captain's decision, created a background chorus that reflected the broader social divisions that Victoria's racist behavior had forced into the open. Cell phones throughout the aircraft were capturing video and audio recordings that would soon spread across social media platforms, transforming a single incident into a national conversation about institutional accountability and moral leadership in contemporary America. Airport security personnel were already approaching the aircraft as Captain Torres coordinated with ground control and airline operations to manage the complex logistics of deplaning nearly 250 passengers while ensuring that the discrimination incident was properly documented for subsequent legal proceedings. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents had been notified about potential civil rights violations, understanding that incidents occurring on commercial aircraft fell under federal jurisdiction and required investigation by authorities with specialized expertise in discrimination cases. Maria Santos and the other flight attendants began the process of preparing passengers for deplaning while maintaining professional composure despite the extraordinary circumstances that had transformed routine customer service into a high-stakes demonstration of institutional values under pressure. Their training had prepared them for medical emergencies, security threats, and technical malfunctions, but nothing in their professional education had specifically addressed situations where moral leadership required choosing between customer satisfaction and civil rights protection. Victoria's desperate attempts to contact her influential connections through phone calls and text messages revealed the extent to which her sense of identity and security depended on social networks that suddenly seemed inadequate to protect her from the consequences of behavior that had crossed legal and ethical boundaries. Her realization that wealth and social status might not shield her from accountability for discriminatory actions marked the beginning of a reckoning that would strip away layers of privilege and protection that had insulated her from consequences throughout her adult life. The deplaning process created an unusual atmosphere of shared experience among passengers who had witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about progress in racial relations and the persistence of overt discrimination in supposedly enlightened social circles. Conversations throughout the terminal would continue long after the immediate inconvenience of rebooking travel arrangements as individuals processed their own responses to witnessing institutional moral courage in action and considered their personal responsibilities as bystanders to discrimination in their own communities and professional environments. Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Patricia Williams arrived at Denver International Airport within 30 minutes of receiving notification about the discrimination incident on Flight 847. Her specialized training in civil rights violations, having taught her to recognize the potential significance of cases that might appear to be simple passenger disputes but actually represented broader patterns of institutional discrimination or individual behavior that violated federal law. The airport's secure interview facilities provided appropriate space for conducting the detailed investigations that would be necessary to determine whether criminal charges were warranted in addition to the civil penalties that would automatically result from documented discrimination in interstate commerce. Dr. Jonathan Hayes sat across from Agent Williams in the sterile interview room, his professional composure intact, despite the emotional toll of being subjected to public humiliation by someone whose racial hatred had transformed a routine business trip into a federal civil rights case. His medical background had prepared him for high-stress situations that required clear thinking under pressure, but nothing in his surgical training had specifically addressed the unique challenges of being a discrimination victim whose testimony would be crucial to ensuring accountability for behavior that violated both federal law and basic human decency. Dr. Hayes, I need to understand the complete sequence of events that led to Captain Torres's decision to cancel the flight. Agent Williams began her interview technique designed to create a comprehensive record that would support subsequent legal proceedings, while ensuring that victim testimony was preserved in a format that could withstand challenges from defense attorneys representing individuals who might claim that their discriminatory behavior resulted from misunderstandings rather than intentional civil rights violations. The background check that Agent Williams had conducted during her drive to the airport revealed Dr. Hayes's distinguished record as a neurosurgeon whose innovative surgical techniques had saved hundreds of lives and whose humanitarian work in underserved communities had earned recognition from medical organizations throughout North America and Europe. His reputation for professional excellence and community service made him an ideal witness whose credibility would be difficult for defense attorneys to challenge, while his calm demeanor and articulate communication style would make him effective in courtroom testimony if criminal charges were filed against Victoria Pemberton. The discrimination began almost immediately after Mrs. Pemberton realized she would be sitting next to me. Dr. Hayes explained, his voice carrying the precise tone he used when presenting medical case studies to colleagues who needed complete and accurate information to understand complex situations. His detailed recollection of Victoria's escalating racist language and demanding behavior provided Agent Williams with the foundation for civil rights charges that could result in significant federal penalties, including fines and potential imprisonment for individuals who interfered with interstate commerce through discriminatory actions. Agent Williams' investigation of Victoria Pemberton's background had revealed a complex history of social privilege built on family wealth that originated in pharmaceutical manufacturing operations with troubling records regarding employee safety, environmental compliance, and ethical research practices. The deeper the FBI investigation went into the Pemberton family's business empire, the clearer it became that Victoria's racist attitudes were connected to broader patterns of exploitation and discrimination that had generated enormous profits through the systematic mistreatment of workers whose racial and economic vulnerability made them targets for corporate abuse. The most shocking discovery emerged from archived company documents that had been preserved in federal regulatory files dating back 30 years, when the Pemberton Pharmaceutical Company had operated manufacturing facilities in Baltimore, where dangerous chemicals were used in drug production without adequate safety protections for workers who were predominantly African American and immigrant populations whose economic desperation made them willing to accept hazardous employment conditions that would have been rejected by workers with better alternatives. Dr. Hayes. I need to show you some documents that may be relevant to understanding Mrs. Pemberton's motivations, Agent Williams said, opening a folder that contained photocopied records from Occupational Safety and Health Administration investigations that had been conducted after multiple workers at Pemberton facilities developed lung diseases that appeared to be connected to chemical exposure during manufacturing processes that prioritized cost reduction over employee safety and environmental protection. The name Rosa Hayes appeared on multiple pages of worker compensation claims that had been filed by employees who developed respiratory illnesses after extended exposure to industrial chemicals used in pharmaceutical manufacturing. Their medical conditions documented through physician reports that detailed lung damage consistent with inhalation of toxic substances that the company had failed to properly contain or warn workers about during their employment. The settlement amounts were modest compared to the medical expenses and lost wages that resulted from occupational diseases that shortened lives and destroyed families. Dr. Hayes felt the room spinning as he recognized his mother's name among the list of workers who had been sickened by corporate negligence. The medical documentation of her lung disease, providing clinical details that connected her death to chemical exposure that had occurred decades before, he understood the scope of the Pemberton family's responsibility for his personal tragedy. The pharmaceutical fortune that had funded Victoria's privileged lifestyle had been built partially through the exploitation of workers like his mother, whose sacrifice to pay for his medical education had been necessitated by the very company that had destroyed her health. Your mother worked for Pemberton Chemical Manufacturing from 1978 to 1985. Agent Williams explained, her voice gentle as she recognized the emotional impact of information that transformed the day's discrimination incident from an isolated act of individual racism into part of a much larger pattern of exploitation and abuse that had affected multiple generations of the same family. The cosmic irony that Victoria had tried to humiliate the son of one of her family's victims added layers of moral complexity to a case that was already challenging conventional understanding of justice and accountability. The worker compensation files revealed that Rosa Hayes had been among dozens of employees who developed lung diseases after working in poorly ventilated facilities where safety equipment was inadequate, and chemical exposure monitoring was virtually non-existent. Corporate cost-cutting measures that prioritized profit margins over worker safety, creating conditions that amounted to industrial negligence on a massive scale. The legal settlements that had been negotiated to resolve worker compensation claims included non-disclosure agreements that prevented affected families from discussing their experiences publicly. Dr. Hayes's hands trembled as he read medical reports that documented his mother's gradual decline from chemical-induced lung disease, her symptoms and progression matching his own memories of her increasing fatigue and breathing difficulties that she had attributed to aging, rather than occupational exposure to toxic substances. The clinical documentation provided scientific confirmation of what he had long suspected about the environmental causes of her death, while revealing the corporate indifference that had treated worker illness as an acceptable cost of business operations. Mrs. Pemberton would have been aware of these worker compensation cases because family members served on the company's board of directors during the period when the settlements were negotiated. Agent Williams continued explaining how Victoria's knowledge of her family's role in Rosa Hayes's death would add intent and malice to her discriminatory behavior toward Dr. Hayes. The psychological profile of someone who would try to humiliate the child of one of her victims suggested levels of callousness and racial hatred that extended far beyond ordinary prejudice into territory that might support federal hate crime charges. The investigation was expanding beyond the immediate discrimination incident to encompass decades of corporate wrongdoing and family wealth that had been accumulated through the systematic exploitation of vulnerable workers whose racial and economic status made them targets for abuse that would never have been tolerated in communities with greater political and social power. Victoria's attack on Dr. Hayes represented not just individual racism, but the continuation of generational patterns of exploitation that had enriched her family while destroying others. The federal courthouse in Denver had become the focal point for media attention that extended far beyond local news coverage, with national television networks, civil rights organizations, and social media influencers recognizing that Victoria Pemberton's prosecution represented a broader test of whether contemporary American institutions would enforce civil rights protections or allow wealth and social influence to shield individuals from accountability for discriminatory behavior that violated both federal law and basic human decency. The courthouse steps were lined with protesters holding signs that demanded justice for Dr. Hayes while supporting Captain Torres's moral courage in choosing principle over profit. United States Attorney Michael Rodriguez had assigned his most experienced civil rights prosecutors to ensure that the federal government's case against Victoria Pemberton would demonstrate institutional commitment to equal protection under law, regardless of defendant's social status or economic resources. The charges included civil rights violations, interference with interstate commerce, and conspiracy to deprive an individual of constitutional rights through discriminatory actions that had been documented by multiple witnesses and preserved through audio and video recordings that would be impossible for defense attorneys to challenge or dismiss. Victoria's legal team consisted of expensive criminal defense attorneys whose previous experience defending wealthy clients had taught them to expect plea negotiations that would allow their clients to avoid prison time through financial settlements and community service arrangements that preserved social reputation while minimizing legal consequences. Their strategy of portraying Victoria's behavior as a misunderstanding rather than intentional discrimination had been undermined by the extensive evidence of her racist language and demanding behavior that multiple witnesses had observed and recorded during the flight incident. The courtroom gallery was packed with observers whose presence reflected the national significance of a case that had become a symbol of institutional accountability in the face of persistent racism with civil rights leaders, legal scholars, and community activists. Understanding that the prosecution's success or failure would influence public expectations about whether contemporary American justice system would protect vulnerable individuals from discrimination or continue historical patterns of providing inadequate remedies for civil rights violations. Dr. Jonathan Hayes's testimony provided compelling evidence of Victoria's discriminatory behavior while demonstrating the dignity and professional accomplishment that made her racist assumptions appear both morally reprehensible and factually ridiculous. His calm recitation of events contrasting sharply with the emotional chaos that Victoria had created through her entitled demands for preferential treatment based on racial prejudice. His description of his mother's death from occupational lung disease caused by chemicals used in Pemberton family manufacturing operations added historical context that revealed patterns of exploitation extending across multiple generations. Captain Rebecca Torres's appearance as a government witness highlighted the institutional courage that had transformed a routine passenger dispute into a national conversation about moral leadership and corporate responsibility. Her testimony explaining the decision-making process that led to flight cancellation and her commitment to protecting all passengers from discrimination regardless of the financial costs involved in enforcing civil rights policies. Her military bearing and obvious competence made her an ideal spokesperson for institutional values that prioritized principle over profit margins. The prosecution's presentation of evidence included financial records that revealed the scope of wealth that Victoria had inherited through family business operations that had exploited vulnerable workers, audio recordings of her racist language during the flight incident, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed her escalating demands for discriminatory treatment of Dr. Hayes. The comprehensive nature of the evidence made it impossible for defense attorneys to claim that Victoria's behavior resulted from misunderstanding rather than intentional civil rights violations. Victoria's appearance in federal court represented a dramatic fall from the social prominence and financial security that had previously insulated her from consequences for behavior that would have resulted in immediate accountability for individuals without comparable wealth and influence. Her expensive clothing and jewelry seemed inappropriate and out of touch in the federal courthouse setting where her privilege appeared as evidence of unearned advantage rather than personal achievement or social contribution. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for community impact statements that revealed the broader significance of discrimination incidents that affected not just immediate victims but entire communities whose members experienced similar prejudice in employment, housing, education, and other areas where individual acts of racism contributed to patterns of exclusion and disadvantage. Dr. Hayes's statement emphasized forgiveness and healing rather than vengeance, his medical training having taught him to focus on curing disease rather than punishing symptoms. Federal Judge Margaret Chen's sentencing decision reflected both the seriousness of civil rights violations and the need to send clear messages about institutional commitment to equal protection under law. Her explanation emphasizing that financial penalties and imprisonment were necessary to demonstrate that discriminatory behavior would have meaningful consequences regardless of defendants' social status or economic resources. The sentence included substantial fines, federal prison time, and community service requirements that would force Victoria to confront the human impact of discrimination in ways that her privileged lifestyle had previously allowed her to avoid. The civil lawsuit that Dr. Hayes filed against the Pemberton estate sought damages not just for the immediate humiliation and emotional distress caused by Victoria's discriminatory behavior, but also for the historical harm that the family's business operations had inflicted on his mother and other workers whose health had been sacrificed to corporate profit margins. The discovery process revealed additional evidence of corporate wrongdoing that had been concealed through non-disclosure agreements and legal settlements designed to prevent public accountability for occupational safety violations. Victoria's financial ruin resulted not just from legal penalties and civil judgments, but also from the social ostracism that followed her transformation from respected socialite to national symbol of persistent racism in contemporary America. Her charitable foundation dissolved as donors withdrew support. Her social circle abandoned her to avoid association with someone whose behavior had become synonymous with the worst aspects of privileged entitlement, and her business interests suffered as corporate partners distanced themselves from the Pemberton family name. The broader impact of Victoria's prosecution extended beyond individual accountability to influence industry standards for addressing discrimination in transportation hospitality and other sectors where customer service policies had historically prioritized conflict avoidance over civil rights protection. Captain Torres's decision to cancel the flight rather than accommodate discriminatory demands had established precedent that encouraged other institutional leaders to choose moral courage over financial convenience when confronting racism in their professional environments. The establishment of the Rosa Hayes Foundation for Occupational Safety represented Dr. Hayes's commitment to transforming personal tragedy into community benefit, using financial resources from the civil settlement to support research advocacy and direct assistance for workers whose health had been compromised by corporate negligence in industries where profit maximization had taken precedence over employee safety and environmental protection. The Foundation's work provided tangible evidence that justice could create positive change, extending far beyond individual accountability to address underlying conditions that enabled exploitation and discrimination. 18 months after the flight that changed everything, Dr. Jonathan Hayes stood in the main lobby of the Rosa Hayes Center for Occupational Health, watching construction workers put the finishing touches on a bronze plaque that would honor his mother's memory while serving thousands of workers whose health had been compromised by industrial negligence, similar to the corporate practices that had claimed her life decades earlier. The medical facility represented the transformation of personal tragedy into community healing, using resources from the civil settlement against the Pemberton estate to create comprehensive healthcare services for families whose economic vulnerability had made them targets for exploitation by companies that prioritized profit over human welfare. The center's services extended far beyond traditional medical treatment to include legal advocacy, educational programs, and policy research designed to prevent future occupational health disasters through stronger safety regulations, better worker protections, and community organizing that gave voice to people whose concerns had historically been ignored by corporate executives and government regulators. Dr. Hayes had recruited colleagues from Johns Hopkins and other leading medical institutions to provide specialized care for workers suffering from respiratory diseases, chemical exposure injuries, and other conditions that resulted from inadequate workplace safety measures in industries where cost-cutting had created dangerous conditions. Captain Rebecca Torres had been promoted to Chief of Flight Operations for her airline, where she had developed comprehensive training programs that prepared crew members to recognize and respond to discrimination incidents with the moral courage and professional competence that civil rights protection required. Her leadership had influenced industry-wide changes in passenger service policies, transforming routine customer relations training to include specific modules on civil rights law, bystander intervention techniques, and institutional accountability for creating inclusive environments where all travelers could expect dignity and respect, regardless of personal characteristics. The aviation industry's response to the Flight 847 incident had included new protocols for documenting discrimination, complaints, federal reporting requirements that created transparency about the frequency and nature of civil rights violations in commercial transportation, and passenger Bill of Rights protections that made discrimination grounds for immediate flight crew intervention, rather than diplomatic compromise that might accommodate prejudiced customers at the expense of targeted individuals. Captain Torres's decision to prioritize principle over profit had established precedent that encouraged other institutional leaders to choose moral leadership when confronting racism in their professional environments. Maria Santos had become a nationally recognized expert on conflict resolution and civil rights protection in customer service industries. Her training programs, adopted by hospitality companies, retail chains, and other businesses where employee interactions with diverse customers required skills that went beyond traditional customer satisfaction approaches to include active protection of civil rights and human dignity. Her work had demonstrated that businesses could maintain profitability while enforcing anti-discrimination policies, challenging assumptions that civil rights protection necessarily conflicted with commercial success. Professor Eleanor Chen's documentation of the Flight 847 incident had become required viewing in civil rights law courses, social justice training programs, and corporate diversity initiatives that used real-world examples to illustrate both the persistence of discrimination in contemporary America and the power of individual courage to create institutional accountability. Her academic research on bystander intervention had shown that witness documentation and public support for discrimination victims could significantly influence outcomes in both legal proceedings and broader social change efforts. The Rosa Hayes Foundation had expanded beyond occupational health to address environmental justice issues, educational equity initiatives, and criminal justice reform programs that reflected Dr. Hayes's understanding that his mother's tragedy was part of broader patterns of exploitation that affected entire communities whose racial and economic status made them vulnerable to corporate abuse and government neglect. The Foundation's work provided tangible evidence that individual acts of courage could create ripple effects, extending far beyond immediate circumstances to influence policy changes that protected millions of people from similar harm. Victoria Pemberton's imprisonment in federal correctional facility in Alabama had stripped away every layer of privilege and protection that had previously insulated her from accountability for behavior rooted in assumptions about racial hierarchy and social entitlement. Her daily routine of institutional meals, shared dormitory sleeping arrangements, and mandatory work assignments represented a complete reversal of the luxury and deference that had characterized her adult life, forcing her to confront the humanity of people she had previously dismissed as inferior based on racial, economic, and social characteristics that had no bearing on personal worth or dignity. The social ostracism that followed Victoria's transformation from respected socialite to convicted civil rights violator had dissolved the network of relationships and influence that had previously provided her identity and security. Her former friends and associates distancing themselves to avoid association with someone whose behavior had become synonymous with the worst aspects of privileged racism. Her charitable foundation had been dissolved, her business interests sold to pay legal fees and civil judgments, and her social calendar replaced by federal prison schedules that made no accommodation for previous status or personal preferences. The broader impact of Victoria's prosecution had extended throughout Denver's social elite, creating conversations about complicity and accountability that forced examination of individual and institutional responses to discrimination that had previously been ignored or minimized through polite silence and diplomatic avoidance. Her fall from grace had demonstrated that wealth and social connections could no longer shield individuals from consequences for civil rights violations, encouraging bystander intervention and community accountability that made discrimination more difficult to commit and impossible to conceal. The transformation of the Pemberton family's pharmaceutical empire from a symbol of corporate exploitation to a model of worker protection and community responsibility had required extensive restructuring under federal oversight, with new management committed to transparency, safety, and social responsibility, replacing the cost-cutting culture that had prioritized profit over human welfare. The company's operations had become subject to enhanced regulatory monitoring worker safety protocols that exceeded federal minimums and community benefit programs that provided healthcare education and economic development resources to areas that had been harmed by previous corporate practices. The visiting room at the Federal Correctional Facility in Aliceville, Alabama, had the sterile atmosphere of institutional spaces designed for supervised human interaction. Its bare walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs creating an environment that stripped away pretense and social performance to reveal the essential humanity that connected all people, regardless of their circumstances or choices. Dr. Jonathan Hayes had driven 3 hours from Birmingham, where he had been consulting on a complex pediatric brain surgery case, to visit the woman whose racial hatred had inadvertently set in motion events that transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined during their confrontation in the first-class cabin of Flight 847. Victoria Pemberton's appearance reflected the complete reversal of fortune that had accompanied her transition from wealthy socialite to federal prisoner, her expensive designer clothing replaced by institutional uniforms that made no distinction between inmates based on previous wealth or social status. The surgical enhancements that had preserved her artificial youth were aging rapidly without access to the cosmetic treatments that had maintained her carefully constructed appearance, revealing the natural progression of time that money could delay but never permanently prevent. The woman who sat across from Dr. Hayes bore little resemblance to the imperious passenger who had demanded his removal from first class through racist language that had shocked fellow travelers and triggered institutional responses that neither of them had anticipated. Her eyes, which had previously radiated entitled confidence and barely contained hatred, now reflected something that approached genuine remorse mixed with the bewildered recognition that her worldview had been fundamentally challenged by encounters with people whose humanity she had spent decades denying or dismissing. "I didn't expect you to come." Victoria's voice carried none of the commanding authority that had characterized her interactions with service workers and social inferiors throughout her privileged life, her words emerging tentatively as if she was uncertain about her right to speak or her visitor's willingness to listen to anything she might say. The institutional environment had taught her lessons about humility and vulnerability that her previous lifestyle had never required her to learn, stripping away layers of entitlement and social protection that had insulated her from accountability and genuine human connection. Doctor Hayes had struggled with his decision to visit Victoria, his medical training emphasizing healing and reconciliation, conflicting with natural human desires for justice and retribution that would allow her to face consequences for her discriminatory behavior without his involvement or forgiveness. His mother's memory had ultimately guided his choice. Rosa's teachings about grace and dignity, suggesting that true healing required engagement with those who had caused harm rather than permanent separation that allowed wounds to fester, without possibility of genuine resolution. My mother taught me that hatred poisoned the person who carried it more than its targets. Dr. Hayes began, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him well in operating rooms where life and death decisions required clear thinking despite emotional pressure and competing demands. His decision to speak about Rosa represented both vulnerability and strength, sharing personal history with someone who had tried to erase his presence from spaces where his achievements had earned him the right to belong. Victoria's response revealed the psychological journey that imprisonment had forced upon someone whose previous life had never required serious self-examination or acknowledgement of the humanity of people she had considered racially and socially inferior. Her recognition that Dr. Hayes's mother had been among the workers, sickened by her family's pharmaceutical operations, had created a connection between past and present that made her current circumstances appear as consequence rather than coincidence, cosmic justice that had taken decades to manifest, but had ultimately arrived with devastating completeness. "I knew about the worker settlements." Victoria admitted, her voice barely audible as she acknowledged complicity in corporate wrongdoing that had extended far beyond the immediate discrimination incident that had triggered her prosecution. Her family's pharmaceutical fortune had been built partially through the exploitation of vulnerable workers, whose racial and economic status made them targets for abuse that would never have been tolerated in communities with greater political and social power, creating generational wealth through practices that destroyed other families' health and economic prospects. The conversation that followed revealed the psychological mechanisms through which privileged individuals maintained moral distance from the human costs of their comfort, using abstract language and bureaucratic procedures to avoid confronting the faces and stories of people whose suffering funded their lifestyle choices and social status. Victoria's acknowledgement of her mother's role in Rosa Hayes' death represented a breakthrough in self-awareness that prison counseling and enforced interaction with diverse populations had gradually created despite her initial resistance to any examination of her assumptions and attitudes. Dr. Hayes' description of his mother's final months, her gradual decline from lung disease that she had never connected to chemical exposure during her employment at Pemberton facilities, provided Victoria with concrete details about the human impact of corporate decisions that had been discussed in boardroom meetings as acceptable risks and cost-benefit calculations, rather than individual tragedies that destroyed families and communities. His calm recitation of medical facts about occupational disease created emotional impact that abstract statistics and legal documents could never achieve. The healing that Dr. Hayes experienced during their conversation came not from Victoria's apologies or expressions of remorse which felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of harm that had been caused, but from his own choice to engage with someone who had wounded him personally and historically, rather than allowing hatred and resentment to define his response to injustice. His mother's example of grace under pressure had taught him that forgiveness was not absolution for wrongdoing, but liberation from the emotional burden of carrying hatred that corroded the soul of the person who harbored it. Victoria's offer to testify in remaining corporate negligence cases represented her recognition that redemption required action beyond personal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Using her knowledge of family business practices to support accountability efforts that could provide justice for other families affected by occupational safety violations that had been concealed through legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Her cooperation with ongoing investigations would help establish patterns of corporate abuse that extended far beyond individual cases to reveal institutional indifference to worker safety that had persisted across multiple decades. The transformation that both individuals experienced through their unlikely dialogue demonstrated the possibility of healing that extended beyond personal reconciliation to address structural conditions that enabled discrimination and exploitation to flourish in communities where victims lacked resources to demand accountability from powerful institutions. Their conversation planted seeds for broader social change that would extend far beyond their individual circumstances to influence policy discussions, corporate practices, and community organizing efforts that gave voice to people whose concerns had historically been ignored. As Dr. Hayes prepared to leave the visiting room, understanding that this might be their final face-to-face conversation, he felt a sense of closure that had been missing since his mother's death decades earlier. The cosmic justice that had brought Victoria's downfall provided vindication for Rosa's sacrifice, while his own choice to engage with her captor demonstrated the power of grace to transform both victim and perpetrator in ways that pure retribution could never achieve. 5 years later, Dr. Jonathan Hayes stood before a packed auditorium at Johns Hopkins, delivering his annual Rosa Hayes Memorial Lecture to an audience that included Captain Rebecca Torres, whose airline now led the industry in passenger dignity policies, and Maria Santos, who had become a sought-after consultant on conflict resolution and civil rights protection. The Rosa Hayes Center for Occupational Health had opened 12 facilities across the country, serving thousands of families affected by corporate negligence, while conducting research that had influenced federal safety regulations and worker protection laws. Victoria Pemberton, approaching the end of her federal sentence, worked quietly in the prison library, tutoring inmates, pursuing their educational goals. Her testimony in corporate negligence cases having helped secure millions in settlements for workers and families harmed by industrial practices that prioritized profit over human welfare. She would never regain her wealth or social status, but she had discovered something more valuable through prison education programs and community service: the possibility of contributing to healing rather than perpetuating harm. The story that began with hatred in Seat 2B had created ripples extending far beyond that airplane cabin, touching countless lives and demonstrating that individual acts of moral courage could challenge institutional indifference and create lasting change. Sometimes the most turbulent flights lead to the safest landings, and justice, though delayed, arrives with perfect timing for those brave enough to stand up for what is right, even when everything seems stacked against them. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make the world more just and fair. Share your thoughts in the comments about a time when you witnessed someone stand up against discrimination. Your stories matter and can inspire others to find their own courage when it's needed most.